Go. Welcome to the PRCA Fuse podcast, the podcast for people with a passion for comms. And today we are joined by Barry Johnson from Purpose Union. Barry's had a fascinating career working with Malala Yousafzai, co-founding an agency, and in this episode he will be taking us into the belly of the beast of major international meetings like COP and UN summits, talking about what goes wrong and how moments of improvisation can lead to huge opportunities. He also gives us tips for the team on the ground and supporting remotely, and we'll look forward to the next COP in Belém and hear what we can expect to see happening in a few months' time. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Barry. You've had a fascinating career so far. You've worked with Malala Yousafzai, and you are one of the co-founders of Purpose Union. Could you tell me a little bit about your career history, your role with Malala, and your role with Purpose Union?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me on, Adrian. So, Irish by birth, been in kind of non-profit development, sustainability, comms, and advocacy for about just shy of 20 years now. Worked with some of the big INGOs, international non-profits like Amnesty, Christian Aid, Action Aid, usually somewhere between what your listeners would understand as public affairs, is sometimes called advocacy or other things in the nonprofit sector. And then was very fortunate. Just about when I hit 30, applied for an ad to go and work for Malala Yousafzai's foundation, which was just being set up at the time as the global director of advocacy, which meant leading her relationships with UN institutions, donor countries, kind of global North governments. And it was at the same time as she was appointed as a UN Messenger of Peace as well, which particularly for today's conversation topic meant that she generally got lots of access to the front row of some of the big summits and moments that were happening. Worked with her for a number of years, and then with two friends, now colleagues, dear partners, Daniela and Lewis, set up Purpose Union. And our aim with Purpose Union was coming into this decade. When we set it up in 2019, we saw what we called the purpose decade ahead. We knew that organizations, individuals with purpose who were working towards a social purpose were the ones who would claim and own the decade to come, particularly with the big kind of environmental, ecological, political, and inequality challenges that we faced. We've seen that borne out across the 5 or 6 years since as well. We tend to work with a mix of nonprofits, governments, and corporates, always on a social or environmental related issue. And a lot of that has led us to support and advise them around key global decision-making moments like COPs, like G20s, G7s, UN General Assembly, WEF, you name it.
Perfect, thank you. And COP has become a big tentpole moment for the media, for lots of organisations, corporates, campaigners. You've got a bit of history with COP. Tell us about when you first went to your first COP meeting. What was it about that struck you? What surprised you there?
Well, my first COP was in Glasgow. I did a lot of COPs remotely to begin with. And then when I finally got to see things from the inside, the belly of the beast. And Glasgow was quite a production. It was also a year delayed because of COVID as well. But I think much like G20 summits, UN heads of government summits, they're a bit of a circus, really. They're a bit of a almost like if you've been to Glastonbury, I think you'll have a similar view of some of these festivals. They're big productions. They're highly bureaucratic. They're highly securitized. The ticketing is tiered. The catering is usually awful. The sleeping accommodation probably worse. And generally, people don't get a whole lot of sleep either.
And in terms of the conversation to go on within COP, we hear about it in the media when the actual meeting is taking place, but that's not the whole story, is it? There's lots of stuff that leads up to the decisions that are made in that week, right?
Yeah, I mean it's the same for any of these global moments. So when I really first started to get involved in this work was 2015. So in 2015, you had two things happen. You had what's now become known as the Paris Agreement, which is the big kind of global legally binding treaty on climate change that guides most of the work that we have now ongoing to remove carbon from our economy. The second thing you had was the UN agree something called the Sustainable Development Goals, or Agenda 2030. Those both happened in the second half of 2015. And really, that was kind of the peak of global summitry. It's the last time kind of interest groups and advocates like myself have been able to write the press release that they wanted to write at the end of the summit. Now, you always write the press release before the summit in any case. And then you kind of take a little bit of a temperature check at the end of the summit as to whether your assessment was right. But the work on COP, really to get us to Paris, started in 1992 in Rio, when the UN came together and said we need a process to tackle climate change. So you've got from 1992 all the way to 2015 there. And even for the UN Summit for the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, when I first started working in the UK, in 2011, you had organizations already beginning to think about what would be the successor to what were called the Millennium Development Goals, even though they hadn't even expired at that time. So really what you get in these summit moments is the culmination of often years, maybe even decades, of work by interest groups, by governments, by officials, usually to get the thing to happen. You also usually have a lot of pushback and interest groups trying to stop the thing to happen as well. There was a play on stage in West End in London recent, Kyoto, which tells the story of how all of that kicked off, and it really gives a good scene. It actually allowed participants in the audience to sit in some of the seats and be part of the action. And it got it quite right, actually, in some of the drama, obviously ramped up for dramatic effect. But some of the strange things that happen in these summits behind closed doors in negotiation rooms. There's that old phrase: you don't want to know how you don't want to see how the sausage is being made. And I think most people would be kind of shocked by what happens in some of these negotiations. But we haven't come up with a better way of figuring out global governance. And I think if we didn't have them, we'd probably still need to invent them.
And we were talking about this earlier, and in your view, you have different classes of COP meetings. There were just kind of minor ones and the major ones. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so you have, COP is fiendishly complex. It is a vast, vast project to decarbonize the entire economy by a certain target date, with the absence of definitions and certainty around the technological requirements to do that means you got to get into some complex stuff. Generally speaking, there'll be a set of milestones, 3 4 year reviews, which mean that on a certain cycle, you will come up to years like Copenhagen, like Paris. Glasgow is bigger, partly because of the UK hosting it, partly because of some of the initiatives that were launched there. And now we come obviously to Belém this year, to Brazil. And again, people are talking about it being a big COP. Usually it means there's a decision about money that needs to be made. So those are always big flashpoints. Or else it'll be about resetting commitments, what are called the nationally determined contributions. And again, we're meant to see those come in Brazil. Those are the key moments where we start to see the ambition and the progress. Then you have more low-key COPs. Last year in Azerbaijan was one, where there's more technical conversations. You get less heads of state showing up, and there's always a little bit of a back and forth about whether heads of state going to these summits is useful or not. Sometimes you get the moments, the kind of the mythic moments where Obama and the Chinese premier decide that they're going to face off 1-to-1 in the corridor and actually have an agreement that could never have happened without the negotiators around them. Other times you get situations where they're just grandstanding, they're not really adding, and it's the nitty gritty of the negotiations that needs to happen. But every now and then, I think alongside the technicalities of it, you need focusing moments. And Paris was a really good example of that. The Paris summit came with a whole host of public diplomacy to engage the public, to get people more alert to the issue of climate change. Glasgow tried to do that again in Boris Johnson's kind of unique way of doing it. And the Brazilians, both because I guess this is a homecoming for them, also because they see themselves as the trustees of the Amazon, and that has such a huge role in climate change, and also because of the domestic implications in Brazil. I think you're seeing an effort to build that kind of political resonance for the summit in a way that hasn't been there for a while. It's tougher to do now that obviously the Americans have pulled away and the issues become more politicized. But increasingly, particularly if America stays out, we're going to have to see countries like Brazil, India, and others take up that leadership mantle. The other thing that we may see at this COP, which would be big, is China really deciding whether or not it's going to take leadership on climate change as the other superpower if America continues to vacate that role.
Wow. So would you say that upcoming COP in Belém is going to be one of the major ones then?
It is. It's going to be major, but in a different way. I think it's going to be a COP that we've never really seen before. Partly, it's the politics. It's where the politics of climate change is. With America out again, and this time, the first time they were out, you could see a path to kind of cities stepping in, corporates stepping in. This time, it's hard to see how we get them back to the table. We're also further into the crisis, and it's more challenging. So I think there's definitely a sense that the politics are going to have to be bigger, and we're going to have to think of new ways of doing it. I think there's some important things about, for example, NDCs, nationally determined contributions. We need to see what Europe's going to bring to the table. There's questions around financing and the just transition that also need to be pinned there. And it's going to be without the kind of central politics of will America lead or won't it? So I think people are a little bit less sure about what the dynamics will be. And the other thing contributing to that is logistically, it's going to be quite unique. Before every COP, there's always the same conversation about will there be enough hotel rooms? Will the airport hold up in the infrastructure needed? This time, there's probably more concern than I've heard historically. The Brazilians have been very keen to reassure that they're on track for the work that needs to be done. But there is talks about people having to sleep three or four to a hammock, ferries being brought in, love barges being refitted and retrofitted, and also just getting there. It's quite an isolated location. It has an airport, but the volume of people coming in, and so it means that Brazil as a country rather than a city might now be hosting. We already hear talks about kind of fringe events and side conferences being held in Rio and Sao Paulo. The World Summit of Mayors is going to be in Rio just before the COP summit. And you can also think that if you're an executive who feels they need to go there, they might be more interested in flying to Rio than Belém. So there'll be kind of an attraction there too. We know those cities, their mayors are putting themselves forward. They know it's a shop window opportunity for them. So who will actually end up in Belém and how that will affect the dynamics, that will also have a different feel to other years. So I think this year is very much, it's a big COP because it's also kind of a transitionary COP. The politics of climate are changing, both domestically and globally. And it's for the Brazilians having kind of kicked off this whole process, potentially to help to reinvigorate it as well.
And the location's interesting, isn't it? Because it's unusual. It does present these logistical challenges, which we haven't seen historically, but it is representative of what Brazil wants to achieve, right? Tell us a little bit about the location and what it means.
So Belém is at the mouth of the Amazon. It's in the Amazon rainforest. And so it's deeply symbolic. It's
Mm.
also a place which has experienced the kind of the outcomes and consequences of a colonial history, which is a dynamic that many people blame for climate change as it currently stands. There's a beautiful word called the mutirao, which is not the correct way of pronouncing it, but it's a kind of indigenous term, which is around the kind of shared collective responsibility for helping those in trouble, and that is the kind of framing that the Brazilian COP presidency has used for this, and they see that as a way of tapping into some of that kind of almost folk knowledge and indigenous knowledge to try and get to the collective agreements and partnerships that are needed to start making the kind of progress we need to see on climate change. So there is you can see the kind of the symbolism, the poetry of hosting it there. Then it does present those logistical challenges. But like I said, we've heard them in a lot of other cities as well. I don't think Glasgow wasn't on the map for COP, and I don't think necessarily it had a convention centre. But did people think it could easily deal with COP, especially during COVID? It had to prove itself, and much like most, we talked to our Brazilian partners out there. Sherlock Holmes, the organization, coming up to hosting the World Cup there, the same conversation was, could we pull this off? And maybe there's a little bit of prejudice in those attitudes as well, because by all accounts that was a fantastic success.
Yeah. And these big meetings like this with like COP and World Economic Forum or the UN summits, from the outside, they look like complete chaos. Whenever we've been working with teams on the ground, they can't get access to the right places, the timetable goes out the window. Things seem to go wrong all the time. Has that happened to you when you've worked at one of these? And can you take us to that moment?
Yeah. There's a couple that come to mind, and I think chaos is right. Organized chaos, probably the more accurate description. We spent one particular day at the UN General Assembly with Malala, and we had a huge program launching a big global education initiative with the UN Secretary General, President Macron, and a bunch of then what are called bilaterals, where you meet kind of one to one, or usually one to one, and then an entire entourage around them of meetings. In the middle of all that, we wanted to do something which took us back to the issue at hand. We wanted to do something quite meaningful, quite powerful on the issue of the voicelessness of many girls who are denied an education. So with the team that I was working with, we came up with a really wonderful creative idea. We were going to deliberately show a scripted video where you couldn't hear the voices. You see the image of the girls talking, and that kind of little moment of confusion is meant to really drive home that despite the fact that we talk about these issues, we don't often listen to or hear the voices of girls. The end of the video would then be subtitled to explain, and music would come in, and it would leave people with a really evocative feeling. Um, Really nice creative, really nice idea. It was going to be wonderful. Thing is, the bureaucracy of these events and so much catch up with you. So we couldn't dim the lights because apparently that needed some kind of UN resolution to happen. The briefing with the moderator didn't happen in the right place at the right time, so they weren't aware of the silent video. So instead of having that wonderful moment, we had confusion in the room, the MC asking for the tech people to get it right. And ultimately, the whole thing kind of fell very, very flat. And while we were trying to kind of explain that to the room, I could see my kind of creative colleague staring me dead in the eye, shaking her head in disappointment about how it all went. So I think one of the things that you take from that is that you kind of need to keep it a bit simple. Don't overcomplicate things, because when you're in that environment, the number of different stakeholders involved in any one small piece of choreography is tiny. But by the opposite, I also got to see up close masters of it in action. So we were whisked from that event via a bunch of very nicely dressed French officials out what we thought was the wrong exit from the room. Turns out we were presented to the world in a bank of French media with this wonderfully staged photo shot with Malala meeting President Macron and Bridget Macron. And then you knew you were in the hands of experts who were making things happen.
Incredible. That sounds from disaster to triumph in a
Mm.
matter of minutes, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the when you're inside these when you're in that kind of VIP bit in the middle, the kind of heads of state VVIP passes that you get, it's weirdly democratic because you can actually bump into anyone in those spaces once you're in that kind of like central circle. And again, on the same day, we had an incident where our meeting with the French president was running heavily over time. I'm waiting outside the door. We've got to get somewhere to meet. I think it was the Afghan president, trying to let his team know that we might be a bit late. And then around me, just a bunch of Japanese people start to assemble with microphones. And I think I know what's about to happen. So I ask one of them, and they ask what they're there for, what's the next meeting. So apparently the Japanese prime minister is coming to meet President Macron. I ask when. They say 5 minutes ago. We are running heavily over schedule. I ask when the Japanese prime minister will arrive. I'm told he's around the corner waiting in the stairwell. So I look around the corner and there's Shinzo Abe bowing, patiently waiting. Malala comes out eventually from the meeting. She wants to debrief me on everything that's been discussed. I say, we'll get to that in a minute. You're about to meet the Japanese prime minister. We've made him very late, so we need to apologize. But also, we're going to go to Japan later in the year, so we want to make sure that we can meet him there. She starts talking to him. She hits every note in her talking points. I realize he doesn't speak great English. So he's not getting what she's saying. I look around, I try and find someone who can translate. I see someone who I think is in his delegation. I ask if they can translate. They say, sure. They start to translate. They have a very good conversation. Prime Minister very graciously invites Malala to meet him in Japan. I think is his translator or his delegation. It turns out she's a journalist for a Japanese media outlet, and I have to ask her to keep everything that they've just heard off the record.
Amazing. I mean, it sounds like you need to have incredible powers of improvisation when you're in on site and at these meetings.
You do. You also need to have a little bit of you have to bit of a brass neck as well. I mean, when we were in COP, we had a wonderful member of staff who was leaving after that particular project. We were running an event at the time with Nicola Sturgeon, who was kind of the star of COP,
Mm.
and our staff member was a huge fan of hers, which was something you could be at the time. And we decided that we'd try and get her a photograph at the end as kind of a thank you, which when these people have kind of minute to minute schedules is a kind of a fair bit of an ask. So we managed to kind of have a word as she was coming into our event with her head of her delegation, arranged for it as she was leaving, and then our staffer got to have a photograph. We got the photograph framed afterwards as a going away gift. So you have to take your opportunities when they come. And we've seen these kinds of things in the media as well. There's a classic image of Greta Thunberg getting blocked in her path through the UN building by Donald Trump as well. So you
Mm.
get these kind of really odd little moments where you get a handshake or a drop by, or one person meets another, that could only happen in a kind of a space like that.
That's amazing. And so, for anyone heading to their first big meeting, like a COP or UN summit, what advice would you give them if they're working on site at these events?
For those on site, I mean, I think one of the first things is get there early. You don't want to be in the busy first day accreditation queue, because those things usually
Mm.
take forever. You need to get the lie of the land. Where are the meeting rooms, where are the briefing rooms, where can you get to, where can you not? So having an extra day or getting there ahead of time to scope the venue, being in the first bunch of people that get accredited, I think is really important. The second thing is just being ready for everything to go wrong. So schedules, always building buffer times into meetings. Everything will run late. A very, very carefully packed bag is important too. So that's mobile phone chargers. It's the right, whichever is that year's on trend, sustainable water bottle. Lots of snacks. Cereal bars are your friend in these instances, and comfortable footwear too. That's always important. Indeed, one of my jobs for Malala was to make sure that when she needed to get somewhere fast, she had her trainers so she could get down the street as quickly as possible.
Wow. And what about booking your flights and accommodation? From what I hear, things don't tend to run to schedule.
Well, I mean, one of the big things is the cost, and I think this is particularly an issue for nonprofits. If you look at many of the cities where these are hosted, you've got real premiums on hotel accommodation. So often you find people are bunking up two or three to a shared apartment. So that's always a challenge. The other thing is when you're flying in and out of these venues, particularly if you've got a heads of government element to it, airspace will be locked down when the presidents of Russia or America or others are flying in and out. You also then have those situations whereby people are maybe ending up, particularly at climate summits, having done 28, 40-hour commutes from small island states to get to these summits. So very often there may be a day or two in transit, and the jet lag is all over the place. However, that can sometimes help, because that means when the negotiations do go to 3 or 4 in the morning, or the fact that you're wide-eyed and jet lag means that you can actually be a bit more alert, and sometimes that plays to your advantage.
Amazing. And what about for teams remotely who are supporting you or people within the meeting? What advice would you give these guys to help you be more effective on the ground?
I think one of the things when you're there is you can kind of get caught up in the whirlwind of it all. So being someone's kind of eyes and ears externally, being able to watch what other organizations are saying, watch how external media is reacting to events. Very often domestic media might have a different take on what the energy or the mood might feel like in the room. I think having clear touch-in points, usually working time zones to your advantage. The only things I find useful is a kind of end of the day kind of oral download, usually a voice note, which is sent back to base. People can pick that up. They can make draft lines, social media messages out of it, have that ready for sign off the next day. So there's a lot of kind of like passing the baton back and forth. The other thing which is really important is version control. Everyone wants to be the first person out with a press release, with the comment, getting the analysis right, but you don't want to have to walk it back, right? So making sure that that last bit of line of text that was agreed, that you didn't think was going to agree, that's reflected in your comment, and therefore it's version 2.4 my comments rather than version 2.3 no comments that goes out and gets signed. So being very, very clear about that too. And then I think the final thing is just being able to have someone at the other end of the line to sense check something with, because when you're on the ground, you're surrounded by a whole flurry of people with very different takes, very different kind of views, and being able to take yourself out of that kind of frenzy for a moment, run things through with someone, get a bit of perspective from outside, is always very helpful as well.
And do you find in those moments where the perspective from the outside is very different from the perspective on the inside?
It can be. I think particularly where we've gotten last ditch, last minute compromised texts in final cops. This happened, for example, in Dubai when we got the language on fossil fuels into the text. It wasn't certain that was going to happen. It certainly wasn't expected in many quarters. It's not, in the grand scheme of things, going to change much in the short term. It is just language, and when you're outside looking in, that might have seemed like a relatively small win. But when you've been in the midst of it all, if you've been in the rooms, if you've been next to the negotiators, if you've been engaged in the back and forth, if you've been part of the conversations, or if you just haven't had a lot of sleep, and you've been away from your family for a number of days and the food's been rubbish and the aircon's been out, and you haven't had a change of underwear because you're there 2 days longer than you planned to be, then actually the scrapping needs to be worth it. It has to have been worth the fight. So I think you can definitely come to the end of a summit like that and find that you're in quite a different place if you've been kind of down in the trenches of it all. And generally, a couple of weeks and a little bit of decent sleep, you get your perspective back. But I think moments like those, you could certainly see a gap opening up.
So hearing you describe that makes me think it really is like a festival. When you get to the end of it. There are some question marks over whether COP should still happen and what the future of COP is. I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
We're 30 years into the COP process now, and the progress that's been achieved is nothing like what's needed to offset catastrophic climate change. And that's not COP's fault. That's the fault of domestic politics. It's the fault of bad faith actors and external influence and lobbying. If we didn't have the COP process, we'd have to set up something which looked fairly similar to it in order to get the kinds of changes, the binding changes that we need. It can always be improved. And I think there are elements of the process which are overly bureaucratic. There are elements which are overly obtuse and elite, but it is complicated stuff. I think one of the things that's happened is maybe a bit of a course correction. This might have been part of what the Brazilians had in mind. It became a bit of a circus. It became somewhere people showed up to be seen, to be there, not necessarily particularly contributing in many ways, maybe actually taking away from the progress that could happen. So it's taking that back a bit, stripping it back who's involved while making sure that those most affected by climate change have a voice and representation. That feels like the direction it needs to get back and focused on again. And that could be what we see happen in Belém at the end of the year.
So thank you. And so Purpose Union has been working on an advice note for COP. Where can our listeners go to find out a bit more?
Thank you very much for asking that, Adrian. They can just go to our website, purposeunion.com, and it's on the homepage, top right-hand side. We've seen the politics of climate change a lot. in the last year, but the fundamental challenges are still there. I think wars, geopolitics, fights between billionaires and presidents are all kind of putting attention and focus elsewhere. Our view is that very quickly we're going to have to get back on top of the climate agenda, and those organizations that were committed to it already, be they corporates, nonprofits, individuals, and activists, are all starting to focus again on Belém. So our Climate Council is a kind of global group that we work together with, along with our new partners in Brazil, Sherlock Communications. And so we've distilled down a key set of messages and analysis there for organizations who are looking at Belém, wondering how they can engage, whether there, whether remotely, and how they can use their voice and their agency at this moment in time to help shape a positive outcome there and into the future.
That sounds like a fantastic resource. Thank you so much for joining us, Barry.
Thanks, Adrian.